fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. As you know, in this podcast, each episode we try and have a conversation that advances the frontier of architectural thinking. And that question of what is architecture and what is its frontier of thinking is certainly a relevant one now when we are besieged by this fantastic virus in such an amazing and unexpected way. So in response to that, from today, we are starting here a new series called Architecture in the Time of Coronavirus. And our objective for the next few weeks, while we are in quarantine, is going to be to have a series of conversations with architects and architectural thinkers and ask them how their lives have been affected by this virus, but more importantly and more broadly, how they think architecture is going to be affected by this pandemic. We are kicking off this conversation today with a great conversation with a duo, the architect and theorist Cruz Garcia from Puerto Rico and the French architect Nathalie Frankowski. The two of them are the principals of WAI Think Tank, WAI, that's WAI Think Tank, and they have a multidisciplinary practice in which they do a series of theoretical and real and conceptual projects in multiple dimensions. I talked to them about their backgrounds, I talked to them about their work, and of course, I asked them, what do they think of architecture in the time of coronavirus? Here we go. Episode 1. Hi, Cruz and Nathalie. Welcome to Architecture Talk.
Hi.
You are the first of our new set of recordings here as we all sit in social isolation in our various homes. I'm at home. Where are you guys? Are you?
We are in the Polish Hill in Pittsburgh.
That's wonderful. Are you working? And you're working out of your home and conducting classes and everything.
Yeah, we mostly work. We are at home working with our students and with a series of events and publications, pretty much all around the world. So
wonderful. So in a moment, we're gonna the topic of today's conversation that I want to have to you is how you're responding to the virus and what you think architecture is, how architectural thinking is to change. But I want to start off by reading the introduction to your website or to your about page, which says, and here we go. WAI Architecture Think Tank is an international studio practicing architecture, urbanism, and architectural research. Founded in Brussels in 2008 by Puerto Rican architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and theorist Cruz Garcia, and French architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and poet Nathalie Frankowski. These are the two of you. WAI and its parallel artist practice, Garcia Frankowski, are based in Pittsburgh while maintaining a presence in Rouen, Beijing, and San Juan. Both of you are currently the Ann Kala visiting professors at Carnegie Mellon University, and as the founding curators of Intelligentsia Gallery, which you are careful to also put out in Mandarin, I presume. In Beijing, Garcia and Frankowski have curated more than 60 group exhibitions dealing with a wide range of topics on the legacy of utopian projects, aesthetic philosophy, the politics of non-objectivity and representation, the cartographic and narrative politics of photography and moving images, the imperatives of contemporary media and technology, object-oriented ontologies, semiotics, ecology, queer theory, and alternative publications and manifestos. I am out of breath, guys.
I'm sorry.
Wow. And when Amelia and I read this description, we were like, wow, okay, immediately we have to interview you. So tell me, how did this sort of expansive palette of architectural thinking, or whatever you call it, how did this come about? One of you is from Puerto Rico, others from France.
Right.
How did you get together and imagine this as your practice? Do you have a short version of this story that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think explaining our origins makes a lot much more sense now. I think like a lot of people will be able to grasp the context where we co-founded our studio. So I'm gonna like try to summarize it as efficiently as I can. So we both of us finished school in 2008. I studied in Puerto Rico, where I come from. Natalie studied
Yep.
in France, where she comes from. We met in our first job in Brussels, in Belgium. 2 weeks after I arrived to Europe, so I moved after I finished my master's in Puerto Rico. I moved to Europe to start working. It was the Lehman Brothers file for bankruptcy, so it was the beginning of the Wall Street crash of 2008.
So the last crash.
Yes,
So this must feel like an anniversary to you.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like a tragic anniversary, but yeah. But oftentimes we're talking about this, and I feel like especially young people, don't realize the context, right? Because they've been in not crisis for some time. So we met during the crisis, and we realized that the state of architecture, everybody getting a lot of people losing their jobs, like people filing for bankruptcy, architectural projects stopping around the world, made us really question or emphasize something that we were questioning already, that it was the relationship of architecture to economical power and to capitalism, and if there's a way to think and practice and imagine ways to make better worlds that don't they're not necessarily responding as a puppet of the market.
So you think of this very much as an alternative practice.
Not necessarily. So after Brussels, we moved to Amsterdam. We moved to Paris, and then we moved to Beijing, where we were staying for 7 years. In Beijing, there was the financial crisis was not really there, but we still were practicing what we thought was a more genuine form of architecture. So in a way, we have always been interested in being able to control your means of production,
Mhm.
and and also being able to ask questions, to use architecture to address questions that you find urgent, and sometimes even without having the answers, just being able to address those questions is what has driven most of the things that we do. We practice in Beijing, and but mostly with creating many different platforms that have many different manifestations. Sometimes more
Right.
design oriented, or curatorial, or publishing, and so on.
Natalie, do you think this is a genuine way to practice? How did you come from France? Where in France, and how did you sort of integrate into this?
So originally, I come from a small town called Rouen, but at that time, so I finished my studies in Paris-La Villette. And so
Uh-huh.
also, like as Cruz mentioned, 2008, I was just graduating. So it was also a first experience in the so-called professional world. And I think what was very interesting is that, as Cruz mentioned, is like this instability that was the first kind of environment that we knew because we were just out of school really forced us to not just question what we could do in the profession, but also how. And I think that's like one of the most important points. And I think it explains a lot all the variation of different projects that we've been doing so far is because the more, I don't really want to use the term traditional, but the more, let's say, expected way of practicing was suddenly put into question because of the economy. So
Right.
just thinking of an architect as somebody who could, just for example, just build or like reply to a client by a design project was suddenly something that was, not necessarily there at that time in 2008. So I think it was interesting to think of what kind of different mediums and what kind of different projects which we could just start exploring, playing with, because not necessarily, as Cruz mentioned, it's not that we really wanted an answer, but it was just, again, it was a time that we have to, again, and I think it's really related to what is happening now. It's a time where we need to question ourselves as
Yeah,
society, also a professional.
so using crisis as opportunity, I mean, it seems like, and let's come back to that topic in 1 second. But I want you to talk a little bit more about why you think all these other modalities, all these other forms of practice, you call yourself narrative architects, for instance. That seems to be a major sort of theoretical claim for you. But even as artist curators, you're major curators. Do you consider all these as allied practices, or are you saying this is all a morphing and new interpretation of what it is to think architecture? Is this all architecture, or are there many different practices?
So, and this is what we avoid. Sometimes you're talking about traditional architecture, or like comprehensive or alternative. Is because when we were in school, and I feel it's still like that. Like the people that we admire and the people that we study, even if of course they have faults and they have things that are questionable. People like Le Corbusier or all the avant-garde in the early 20th century. They didn't divide it, what they were doing, as different practices. It was all one practice of thinking about architecture and thinking how architecture can transform the world. And that
Yeah.
may require you to make a book, or may require you to make an exhibition, or may require you to lecture or to teach or to
Yes.
design a building, right? So a building is just
Yeah.
a really small component of architecture in that sense.
Yeah, Corbusier did all of those, didn't he?
Exactly. Yeah, and not only him, and Lisinski did, and Casimir Malevich, and you have all
Yeah.
this repertoire of strategies that have been employed by people that didn't saw a division, a professionalization in what they were doing, but actually it was a way of living and a way of thinking and a way of interacting with the world.
And so you're sort of returning to this, if you want, pre-specialization, in many ways modernist vision of architecture as this kind of expansive way of being in the world.
Exactly.
Yes?
Right,
Exactly.
exactly.
And in a way challenging, because it's still related to the economy, right? So what happens with capitalism, or with neoliberal capitalism, is that we get compartmentalized in ways where we can exchange how we use our time for money, right? So then we have architecture being turned into this hyper specific, like a window consultant slash technical designer slash, and so and it gets narrowed down in a way so you can certify what you're doing and in a way get rewarded economically for it, right? So it's still something that really responds to an economical situation and not necessarily to the needs of the world.
Right. Let's drill down a little bit on that, because you take a very strong position on modernism in your, at least on your website and in your writings, and you see have specifically articulated what you call narrative architecture as an alternative to modernism. So clarify and explain that to us, and I want to also, if you have the opportunity, talk a little bit, maybe take the example of La Poème de WAI. I mean, I know La Poème d'Angle Droit. I'm listening to your it's a play over there, and I saw a lot of chord in the video that you have made,
And you're actually from Chandigarh, right?
I am from Chandigarh, and I'm a recovering modernist myself. So,
Natalie grew up like 1 hour from Firmini, which is also
Right.
another
of course, yeah. Corbusier haunts us all. Yes.
and in a way, so our stance with the modernism is problematic, as it should be for everybody.
Yeah.
So we believe in a lot of the principles of what modernism wished the world would do, like providing a sort of universalization of methods and strategies of designing architecture and the city. Also for the modernists in the pure sense, in the hardcore sense, there was no really a separation between architecture and urbanism, which for also is also really important to understand that and to apply it. When it comes to narrative architecture, the way we see it and the way we use it, is a part of what we do. It's not all, but I think it's really important, especially because it allows us to question a bunch of things. Is that for us, narrative architecture is a form of architecture that employs architectural strategies. So our mediums and strategies of presentation and representation in order to create stories that reveal the ideology, the hegemonic ideologies behind architecture.
Okay, so that's what you specifically you say. Narrative architecture points the ideological guns back at modernism.
Exactly.
So why do you have modernism in your crosshairs?
Because we feel we are really embedded in that history that started with the construction of the modern movement, with the idea of a modern architecture and architecture modern and the principles and the struggle. So basically, modernism is born in architecture, is born after the Great War and after some sort of struggles of decolonization, and in a way we are still embedded in the same struggle. So I feel like the most meaningful transformations really happen at the beginning of the 20th century, and we are somehow still struggling with them. And we don't point the guns only at modernism, but in the way to make the argument of the origins of narrative architecture in the 20th century, it was modernism that became the hegemonic ideology, and all that is good and all that is bad with it, like all the colonial apparatus that goes with it, all the colonial ambitions. But at the same time, there's a bunch of struggles of emancipation that use modernism as their vocabulary too, right? So it has
So
that.
let's turn, yeah. So let's talk. You mentioned something very interesting, and you have used the phrase decolonization in your writing, and that's a phrase that I have written something a little bit about, and very interested in that phrase. And I'm very intrigued by, Cruz, you're from Puerto Rico, and
Yes.
Natalie is from Paris, and sort of a colonization of the world
Yeah.
that was done by the West and by modernism, if you like, or universality. I'm growing up in Chandigarh. I was, of course, intimately. It's a complex thing. It's a complex thing, right?
Yes.
So, Cruz, why don't you talk to me about what is the project of decolonization uh, that you think your work engages?
Well, so I think like this could be tackled in many different directions. It
But
happens.
your work specifically, yeah.
Yeah, but even in our work, it happens in many different manifestations. Like for example, the way we see, going back to your previous question, narrative architecture allows us to construct the colonial narratives that allow us to imagine those struggles against the colonizing powers. So we can construct narratives about scenarios, positive or negative or neutral. Well, nothing is really neutral, but politically charged scenarios that put architecture at the crossroads of political hegemony and the struggles of liberation.
Give me
Of
an example. Give me an
For
example.
example, so there's a project that we've been working on that started with the post-colonial room. And in that post-colonial room, we will reclaim some of the paintings of the Hudson River School of Painting that used to go in the Americas and in South America and in the global South, making all these panoramas, somehow eliminating any sort of evidence that there are people inhabiting those places and transforming nature. So whatever people would appear, they will appear like they were in some way not powerful enough to transform their environment. So it was an invitation for colonization, and we will subvert them not by challenging that position, but by pushing them to the extreme. For example, using Puerto Rico as an example, what happens when the colonizing powers actually win, right? And they have removed all the people, all the local people from these lands, and they
Right.
turn this into some sort of perfect idyllic paradise, right? Isn't that eerie, even if it's beautiful, right? And in that way, we can start talking about really uncomfortable conversations. After that, we've been working with a collective called Post Novis, and post nobis is a joint.
No, but before we go down to that road, let me stay with the post-colonial room, a beautiful concept. I've never heard of it, and I'd like to. So you're talking about a revisioning of the paintings, and that's good. But I'm also interested in the room itself.
Yes.
Is the room simply a cool neo-modernist room, or is the room something else also?
No, the room is really important. Why? Because it has a lot of relationship to the origins of the idea of the museum as an experiment where all these colonizing powers will go around the world collecting items from different cultures, and they will bring them back to a room and they will display them as art, right? So
Yeah, the
it kind of
total colonial construct, no question.
exactly. And so the first iteration of our post-colonial room consisted of a. So we did it in Nebraska, and we kind of borrowed or kidnapped a bunch of the tropical trees that were planted in potted around the school and in the institutions there, that nobody actually noticed that they're there, but for me they were really important because they were these tropical bodies that have been taken out of their context. We took all those trees and put them inside the room, and then we made all these videos with the images of the tropical rainforests in Puerto Rico, and then we put all the prints of the paintings of the Hudson River School inserted with these architectures, printed on canvases, so they still remain. So it was a full installation, a total installation with the sense of smell, the neon lights, the sound. It was all alluding to this colonial rooms, the museum as a colonial experience, but we wanted to think about the post-colonial room, so we were making it really evident. It had a poem also about the struggle of the occupation of these lands and so on.
Natalie, that's great. Natalie, I was. Let's come back to what you had raised. The sense of crisis of the present. I'm interested in the question of what is the crisis and how we can think about it. And just since we're on the post-colonial question, thinking about what a pandemic does to a cultural memory and a civilization is to remember, of course, that the native populations of the Americas dealt with this 500 years ago, right? I mean, they know and remember it really well. But talk to me about this forum that you have set up. What's it called? Loud readers, and how are you constructing your practice response to the current crisis that we find ourselves in?
I think what, like going back a bit to the parallel with how we started in 2008, which of course was a very different crisis because unfortunately nowadays, we are speaking of, human loss, which is really, really, of course, really tragic in so many levels. But I think also it's a time, well, as we can see, because everybody has to kind of be more patient. It's time where we can take a bit of more time actually to question ourselves, rethink, start new conversation. And all this is really needed because, as you know, the word crisis mean we are in a period that will lead to some changes that we cannot avoid. So how together, we can start a new discussion and start to try to think of a new future that could come out of this very tragic moment in time. So what was very important for us is, because I feel it's just also, something very human, is we want to exchange more. Everybody feels the need to communicate more. We cannot do it, unfortunately, some of us cannot do it physically. So that's why I feel we are all in need to create this kind of new platforms where we can just come together and exchange about all these different topics, and especially going back to the profession of architecture, that is, we personally think that it's been a while that architecture is already shifting, and the model that was thought to be so successful for so many years has to be, really addressed, questioned, challenged, because also there's like a lot of new generation coming into the field, and we all know that architecture tends to be, quite slow in terms of redefining itself. And so now I think it's a good opportunity to come all together and to try to think what can happen next.
What are some of the things you would like to see happening next? What are new modalities for architecture that you would like to see and practice in?
There must be a shift from the, like, in practical sense, there must be a shift in the way that we are educating future architects to consider what the discipline can do. So it shouldn't be just getting jobs for all these multinationals or gigantic corporations that require a certain type of project that is always colossal,
Right.
always not really critical of what they're producing in the sense of the ideology that is serving. So there has to be a shift regarding that. So and that will imply like having smaller studios that are really thinking about what it's doing and thinking about how to contribute to society. Will also affect the way we think about cities, right? Like bringing more people to the discipline that have been not only not included in the design but oppressed by it. They should be the ones designing the cities. They should be the ones designing and planning the future. It shouldn't.
Subaltern, yeah.
Yeah, the discipline has to change, from the from the
Mm-hmm.
from the demographic constitution that makes it to the social and economic demographic also that forms it, because having people that look different but they still come from privileged backgrounds is not really going to change the world, because
Right.
we're still serving to the power, and we're still not really challenging the status quo, and thus oppression and economic inequality and social disparity and
No, but Cruz, that's a long established agenda in architecture. I
oh
mean, one can
yes,
say modernism started out as a social project, and then
yes,
became a capitalist project. So that's not new, really.
no, it's not new.
I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying it's not really 21st century, is it?
Yeah, and also at the same time, the economic system that we're fighting and the idea of colonialism, it also is super old too, right? So
Of course, of
so
course.
and that's why at the same time for us it's so important to look at history as an instrument that we had to work with.
But I think
um,
a lot of questions that we raise, and a lot like it going back also to the way we practice or what we want to address, is like we feel nothing is really new in the discussion, and I think that's also what makes it a little bit more urgent for us, is that it's been all these topics that has been discussing for years, but yet we don't really see any shift or change in the main, let's say, institution or main discussions that are going around architecture, or as Cruz mentioned too, in architectural education. So I think the hope that can come out in starting, again, all these different platforms and engaging with different people is how can we make it even more visible, because a lot of different actors are already practicing within these different topics, and things are happening, but somehow it has to be made more mainstream. It has to be there, and also we need to set a new example for new generation that are going to practice too. Because the problem is like also we feel there's like such a gap in, again, like this kind of main discourse around architecture, whereas the way of practicing, of thinking yourself and also your place in society as an architect
Yeah.
already shift. So how can we need also to prepare more of a new generation to this change, to this shift
So,
that already
yeah.
happened.
I mean, so let me say. So, for instance, what has this global pandemic revealed to you that is new, that has been enlightening about the world? What have you realized? What is it opening up your eyes and ears to?
okay, so to be honest, it made me realize that people in privileged positions don't know how bad everybody else has it.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I feel like New York is what's happening in New York right now. To give you a really specific example, is
Mm-hmm.
is Puerto Rico during the hurricane slightly less bad because they have electricity and
Right. Right.
water, right?
Yeah.
But the people dying and the government doing nothing and putting a boat in the coast that only has 3 patients because of all the bureaucracy that they need to have,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the president being completely disrespectful and not really paying attention. We all
Mm-hmm.
been through that. Like it happened,
Yeah.
it's been documented. We can go
Yeah.
to Africa. We can go to the what people call the global south.
Yeah.
It happens all the time, but now it's happening in the metropolis, so we are aware because then the TV covers it every day and everybody
Yeah.
sees
Yeah.
how terrible it
Of
is.
course.
But
But
so
that's
it's
an yeah. That's they're not gonna. It's not gonna change anybody. That's the metropolitan centers is what matters, and they're gonna say, "Yep, yep, that was the important thing."
exactly.
So yeah, 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 yeah.
So in a way I think it's been revealing for some people, definitely not for us.
Mm.
Like we were
Yeah, it
out
feel.
there.
I mean, one of the things that occurred to me was for the first time it feels in America like this is a real war zone. I mean, or a major disaster zone where everybody feels threatened all the time.
Yeah, maybe in that scale, yeah. But also, it's like growing up in Puerto Rico, like being born with an American passport and knowing that it really means nothing because you're in an island that was occupied in 1898. It showed me all of this since really early. I grew up, with FBI killing intellectuals in my country, that were Americans too, right? So I and then growing up, seeing how the civil rights movement was treated, seeing the AIDS pandemic in a way, right? Like how it was ostracized and how many people died because of the negligence and the criminal attitude of
Yeah,
the
yeah, of course. Yeah.
administrators. So all those things I feel like when you're raised under those premises and studying in Puerto Rico, really in the University of Puerto Rico, where I have all these amazing writers and people that deal with this in the daily life, since the 60s, since the 70s, when it was even much more violent. It really prepares you in a way to be aware. It's not to be more resilient, because I don't believe that it makes you strong. Yeah, sometimes people say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We have a joke that says, like, what doesn't kill you now will kill you later.
Okay, I get that. I mean, Cruz, I'm totally in sync with you. All the things you're saying, I experienced and felt, in different registers in India. But let me turn to Natalie again and say, Natalie, you grew up in a small town near Fermini. I assume reasonably well ensconced. I have stereotypes about small French towns, so I won't bore you with those. But how do you feel? In what is your kind of emotional, ethical engagement with the topic of the post-colonial here?
Well, to I think it comes also from just a little bit my background as for my family, because even if so what you were saying about the countryside of France, I think is quite accurate. So,
Okay,
so
okay.
I grew up
Thank
in
God. Yes.
a nice old house with all animals around it, but I've some actually, so I'm French on my mom's side, but my dad is half Polish and half Scottish.
Wow,
Um,
you're really confused. Yeah, good.
It's gonna get more complicated now.
Go
and
on.
no, I think that also, growing up in this type of family, that also brought a lot of different history to it, and obviously, the Second World War,
Mhm.
and the fact that on the side of my Polish family, everybody, most of the family was either killed or had to move out of Poland.
Mhm.
So there was, um, I think there was a lit. I don't know if I would call it a discomfort, but of course, like a small realization of something bigger as a perception of, growing up, even in a context as friends. So I think, first of all, just the fact that I think when you grow up with a family that comes also from different places, I didn't identify myself only to one context. And I think it allowed me also to have a little bit more setback on the French culture and
Right.
try to be a little bit more critical about it, especially, of course, of all the French colonial history that
course.
we are all familiar with. So I think all this just helped me again to. I think all this became even more evident when we started to travel more and to live in different places and different contexts, where I think it's again like being able to have this setback and being able to be critical of your own history.
But even you always talk to me about all your problems, with the sort of like how much you question, and it's part of your also your upbringing too. All the question with the banlieue in Paris and all that,
Right.
like how the sort of former colonies of France have been somehow pushed away from the centers of power
Right.
too. So it's not only
Well,
the
certainly. I mean, the colonial world is very much present in all the metropolitan locations. Certainly, you see that in Paris and London and New York, and so I mean, I see that. Uh, let's shift the topic a little bit, and so tell me a little bit about your this Loud Readers project. So what is Loud Readers, and what specifically will you be doing? Here's your opportunity to plug it.
So to give you some context, so again, and I mentioned it a bit before, the project of Post Novis that is based on the last year was the anniversary of the Bauhaus,
Yes.
the
Yes.
100-year anniversary of the Bauhaus, the centenary.
Yeah.
And we consider that really problematic because in the Bauhaus, women were not even allowed to study architecture. And at the same time of the Bauhaus, there was something called UNOVIS in the People's Art School in Vitebsk, where women and pretty much children could study architecture together. And they even like a woman like Vera Molayeva was running the school. But we don't
Hmm.
learn about this in school. We learn about Gropius, 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 and like the
GV. Yes.
of course the men-run modernism, not the other forms of modernisms. And at the same time, in Puerto Rico, there were a practice of alternative education that started in Cuba in the end of the 1800s, uh, mostly performed by men too. But in Puerto Rico, there was a really radical, hardcore feminist woman called Luisa Capetillo, and she was an anarchist, syndicalist, and so on. And she was one of the loud readers. Loud readers were tobacco workers that were in the alienating labor of rolling cigars all day, very little rights and very little pay. They will hire one of their own that could read to read aloud for them. At the beginning, they would read like classics like Victor Hugo and probably Benjamin or something like that. But after, they will start reading Kropotkin, Bakunin, Engels, Marx. And of course, workers will be much more politicized and educated into their rights, and they will strike and they will ask for better rights and they will have all these suffragist movements and so on. It became illegal, of course, because what boss wants empower workers? That's the question, right? Um, so we wanted in the post novice creation, in the collective we made in the 100-year anniversary of novice and the post colonial room and all these ideas coming together, we made a collective based on the idea of the loud readers. And we've been working with it through exhibitions and publications and lectures. And now, when this happened, we had planned our book release of narrative architecture and some exhibitions and some discussions happening in real physical form all around the world. And all this has been transformed. And we saw a really good opportunity to bring that idea of the loud reader even in a more democratized way, where people can join in Zoom meetings or in YouTube videos or Facebook Live and invite different practitioners from all around the world. So we have like first talk is Traum Nobel from Brosso Charleroi and Paris, and they are the curators of Eurotopia, that is the Belgian pavilion of the Venice Biennale in 2018, also like a decolonizing project. Uh, then we have
So what's going to happen? This talk will be on what, on YouTube, and people will
yes, so it's gonna be a Zoom meeting. So Zoom has
a
become
Zoom
the
meeting. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
ubiquitous format, so people
Yes.
can participate. But also, it's gonna be live stream in Facebook and hopefully in YouTube. And then we're gonna
Okay.
have different people bringing. All of them are reading or a book that they find really important or critical, and they're gonna use that as a premise to address all the pressing questions that we feel must be addressed. And we have Ilse Wolf from South Africa. We have a really amazing list of loud readers coming through the summer.
How do you publicize all this?
So it's gonna be on our website on the loud readers section in the waithinktank.com/loud readers. Then it's gonna be also available in Vimeo and in YouTube and in Facebook. So uh,
So you're just relying
everywhere,
on social media to sort of put it out. Yeah.
Instagram, it's gonna be all over the place.
Okay. Okay.
We're
Fantastic.
gonna try to make it also that people feel free to join and ask questions and participate. Students, of course, it has a capacity because we don't know until how much can these things resist. But we will push the limits to see where it goes.
Fantastic. How do you think your forum, loud readers, and all your forums actively engage, non-metropolitan audiences, like
Hopefully,
non,
hopefully,
hopefully, yeah.
hopefully, hopefully, we find ways to infiltrate different places. That will
What are
depend on
your strategies to sort of promote that?
So one will be to invite as diverse a group as we can,
Hmm.
and we work really hard. We did it when we run the gallery in Beijing. We had like artists from 6 continents, everywhere except Antarctica, pretty much. Uh,
Hmm.
and we will really have to work hard into reading the literature and finding people from different backgrounds and different places that can join in and make this really inclusive and exciting and critical.
Hmm.
So we will have to do our homework, and we will have also to find ways to engage with. Sometimes we get emails and messages in Instagram for people that are practicing in really non-metropolitan places in conflict. So that's really important for us. I feel
Oh, you
that
do. That's great.
yeah, it happens. I feel maybe because of the type of work we do. So we're not famous or nothing at all. But if a young person is looking for something that deals with decolonization, it may Google may lead them to us somehow at some point, or
Uh-huh.
Utopia or whatever. So that it has all these you know uh, interlinks that may connect us.
Hmm.
Uh, we try to always make things that are available. So even if we publish books that are sold in stores or things that are shown in museums, we always try to have everything online, freely available, all the
I mean,
text and
it seems
everything.
to me you are like extremely contemporary media savvy. I'm just so impressed by your website.
Yeah.
I mean, is your practice really basically your web presence? Would you put that as your center of your work?
It's really important, but we're real people too. So and we move around and we interact and we make a lot of physical things like events where people can join. But
Mm,
living in Beijing for 7 years and writing in English mostly, it really forced us to always keep reaching as far as you can, right?
mm,
Because the immediate context is different, right? Like the language is different, and there's a bunch of barriers that even if we can interact with certain part of the city, it's not really with everywhere and everything. So that was one step. At the same time, internet was mostly blocked there, so it's kind of funny that you compliment us for our media knowledge because
right.
I feel like we're not that great into that, but we try to reach out, we try to understand what our younger students, 17-year-old, we do workshops with high schoolers, with elementary school children. What's happening, they
Mm.
talk about whatever those games with blocks. What's the name?
Fortnite.
Minecraft, Fortnite. Yeah,
Minecraft. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what are they watching? What are they? Even if we're not gonna do it, but at least to know what's happening, and stay up to date with those things,
yeah.
uh,
Try and do that. I mean, yeah, that's a good.
But
and just
yeah,
understanding that
I think it's also like, because as Chris mentioned, we always wanted to make. I mean, it sounds ambitious, but as accessible as possible. More of a discussion again than what we are doing is just to try to bring more people into the exchange. And I think, well, of course, not we're very aware that not everybody has access to internet, which is also like a big question, talking about the pandemic that is happening right now and the fact that a lot of education is shifting online.
Equity and access is a big question, and we are dealing with
Exactly.
that at the university too. But as we move towards the end over here, let me sort of try and throw in a couple of curveballs and try and see how you respond. And I'm glad you pick up this American phraseology curveball. It took me a while to sort of know that. Okay, but talk to me about how what you have a proposal for object-oriented ontologies.
Mhm.
And you talk a lot about representation, aesthetic theory, and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Uh, what is the relevance of object oriented ontologies in the current pandemic, do you think, as you look at it?
So we have worked with the theory of object-oriented ontology, but this is a disclaimer. We start in complete contrast to how architecture uses philosophy most of the time.
Hmm.
So what SciArc does, for example, to take a philosophy book and make aesthetics out of it,
Mhm.
I am completely against it. I think like all these philosophical questions allow us to frame works and ways of thinking about the world in different ways. So we did an exhibition based on triple O, and we will look at artists working with how to. It sounds weird, but how to objectify things in a way, how to tackle them like objects, concepts that maybe don't appear as objects initially. Uh, what does that
Yeah,
allow?
and I like the kind of things you put up, but I'm saying, how do you contextualize that work? What do you think is, how do you bring that uh, work into dialogue with the concerns, with the pandemic?
I think like a way to bring it into dialogue is to understand how all these conditions, environmental, uh, material, economic, they should be treated as urgent. To use what the paraphrase what they say, like hyper objects. These big
Mm.
things that are really that have many different relationships. I think like triple O in a way is really similar to the theory of spherology of Peter Sloterdijk, where he
Mhm.
talks about foam bubbles affecting the bubbles around them. So in a way, those bubbles are a bit like by the objects. So I feel like those two philosophical points of view are very related, and using those things, those philosophical frameworks, may help us understand that the climate is really urgent, but so is economic inequality. So if we look at them as hyper objects, both of them, we should deal with them as such. So one
Yes.
doesn't precede the other, and it's not until we acknowledge that all these things are really real and they are there, even if you cannot see them or quantify them, you still need to deal with them. So I think that would be a way to use those philosophical frameworks to see what's
Is,
happening now.
is the virus a hyper object, the virus itself?
The access to health is, I feel.
No, but not about, what about the virus itself?
I feel the virus is an object, but for example, if we will have responsible governments that spend most of the money on health and education, none of this would have happened. I feel like this was a completely controllable situation, but they didn't pay
That's a
attention
very
to it.
modernist response to think that we could have controlled
Oh,
everything through
yes,
health
totally.
education
I
and
mean, the
architecture.
science is there and the money is there, judging by the budget of the military, for example. But but
This is where modernism started, also as a basically a health project in the
yes,
colonial world.
it is
Right.
exactly right. Like the
Exactly. Yeah.
hygienic need of Europe, that people you get a cold and you die when you're 20,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And
Okay. Let me throw a second curve, a second sort of another kind of a curveball at you. You make a big deal about You say in the kingdom of architecture, the shapes reign supreme. That sounds extremely formalist, so almost
It is.
Cornell to me. Please explain.
I always tell our students, because sometimes they question, why are you making us deal with form like this? I say, like, we are formalists. Humans are formalists. We like, you like a certain genre of music, that's form. You like certain type of clothes, that's form. So in buildings,
I'm big into fashion, by the way. Yeah, go on.
and we've been obsessed with form since the beginning of humanity, of humankind, right? Like, even before, probably Neanderthals were also formalists too, right? The idea is that form is really important, and it has always been a tool that the powerful have understood, but the oppressed is not allowed to use it in the same way.
So,
So
how do we use form in the current pandemic?
in the current pandemic, form, well, starting with the form of planning in the way that we arrange everything, but the form of the ways the cities are designed, for example, access to public transportation, that's form, right?
Hmm.
If we make the most amazing monuments, wouldn't be the skyscrapers in New York, will be schools and hospitals, right? And that's where all the architectural intelligence is spending all their brain cells. This problem would have been completely different, right? Uh, so if we consolidate all the downtown Manhattan, and instead of making all those towers that are symbols to the accumulation of wealth,
Capital. Yeah.
of capital, of economic capital and financial capital, we will make the most amazing monuments to medicine and science and education. We wouldn't have none of this, right? So the form is
So
there, it's just badly put and badly employed by the wrong people, apparently.
old Corbu must be very happy now because he wanted the big towers with in green landscapes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly, exactly, exactly.
What do you think? Let Natalie. I'm going to give you the last word here. Do you think the modernist project, the let's say the Corbusian project, much vilified in the last 20, 30 years, is still is has something to offer us as we enter into the 21st century with this new virus in this new way?
Of course, of course. I think like it's something that we discuss a lot nowadays with Cruz because, especially in the context, I think of being and teaching in US, is that all the modernist projects, especially the European one, especially the one started by Le Corbusier, had, at his core, we think a very, very humanist approach.
Mm.
And I think a lot of the modernist project was really about making the life of people better, thinking the cities, the way of inhabiting in a much more hygienic, but also, you know, uh, much more comfortable, have more quality of life, and above all, in a very universalist perspective. We are very aware that universalist is like also a term that could be start a
Colonialism, yeah.
totally new discussion.
Mm.
But if we focus on the optimist or positive side of universalism and trying to think of how we can offer a better quality of life for everybody. It's of course like a very optimist perspective, but I think it's something that we should all strive for. So to think that all this project died when Prutaigo, for example, collapsed, which is like
Yeah, icon, yeah.
something that was like right, like heavily written about and heavily spoken about in many different contexts is a lie. I think we should, again, like Cruz mentioned it before, but that's also like the essence of what Le Corbusier was talking about, is like he didn't see any distinction between cities and architecture. And this forces us as architects to think the city in a very I would say, like civilian way of thinking ourselves as part of a community, building for a community, thinking of how can we live together, and not thinking again as the architecture as solely being one building for one person. It's like it goes on with a bigger project of thinking of us living all together in the world. And I think this very optimistic point of view is something, especially today in a period of crisis, that we can all be made aware. How can we live better together? Because as the pandemic, in times like this, just thinking of ourselves doesn't really lead to anything. So
That's right. That's right. That's wonderful. How to rethink the concept of the universal at the
right.
time of a pandemic. That's a great place, perhaps, for us to end. Cruz and Natalie, it has been such a delight to have this conversation with you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much for having us.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for the really urgent questions.
Right. Yes.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is architect and fellow architectural thinker, Sami Prouty. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. And if you did, please do remember to subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have suggestions for new topics or guests. You can reach out to us via our website or Instagram. See you next time.